Everybody's checked in. We're good to go. Time to start talking about databases. What's a database? It's a big folder of some sort that holds data. That'll do. Okay. What else is it?
The source of somewhere's data, like a website's data.
The source of somewhere's data, the place that holds stuff for a website. Okay. What else is it? Shout it on out. Okay, I know it's Monday, but it is like 5 o'clock, and I feel like you should have all reached your full caffeine potential for the day. I mean, I'm on like cup of coffee number 6 at this point. I've given up on this. I swore I was going to give up caffeine. Yeah, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So you're as caffeinated and awake as you're going to get before you hit the downslide into dinner. So throw them on out there. What's databases? Any ideas? Collected information. Okay, what else is it? A directory. Okay. What do you mean by a directory? Like a phone book. That's a really good analogy for one. Okay. A phone book is absolutely, definitely a type of database. Why is a phone book a type of database? How many of you even have seen a phone book in the last 5 years? Okay. Wow. That's no one, basically. For those of you who remember what a phone book is, it's actually a pretty good way to describe a database. It is organized in some fashion, and what we mean by organized is that it's indexed in some way. What does indexing do to a bunch of information? Categorizes it. Why do you index something?
So you can have an easier time of accessing what you need.
Yes, so you can have an easier time of accessing what you need, but even more simply, just so you can find it, right? A database, maybe the best analogy for it is a bucket. It is a big, big bucket, and without some way to dig through the bucket and know what piece of information you're going for, it's just a bucket full of code or information that is irrelevant unless it points to something, unless it's attached to something, right? Remember how we were talking in web application development about multi-tier architecture? How you can switch out the kind of bucket that holds all your information if you want to. Maybe it's an easier bucket for you to work with. It's wider, it's lower, instead of a taller, narrower bucket. Also not a bad analogy for the different kinds of databases that are out there. Some databases are very flat on top. You can look at them and scan the whole thing and go, yep, that's the piece I want. Some of them you have to go through a process of going, I want this class of information, and then I want this even more specific kind of information, and then I want a specific instance from out of that kind of information. So when we think about databases, the best way to think about them is pouring a whole lot of stuff into a bucket and then figuring out how you pull one specific thing out of that bucket. You might think of it as a string tied to a toy inside that bucket. All right, how many of you guys had like toy chests or buckets or something like that when you were a kid? Whatever, you'd go into it and you'd grab, for Barbies or G.I. Joes or Legos or whatever, or Lincoln Logs. Because if you were really cool, you had Lincoln Logs. We had off-brand Lincoln Logs, but that's cool. So think of what you're doing as tying a string to a toy and then letting a tag hang outside the bucket so that at any time, if you want to, you can be like, I want to grab every Lego in this bucket. Grab all the strings that are labeled Lego and yank. And then you have a whole big bunch of stuff out of the bucket that you know is the right stuff, right? That is a really good analogy for what's happening inside a database, and it's exactly what's happening when we make a query on a website, when we do something like, I'm going to log into this website, and my username is Tara, and my password is password ! That's totally what my password is everywhere, guys. Give it a shot. Try it out. Find out what happens. So when you do that and you log in, the website says, okay, it seems like this person thinks that we have a username Tara. So what you're doing is you're kind of fiddling around the outsides of the bucket and looking for the string that says Tara and then going and pulling out the chunk of information that is related to me or to you when you log into that site. It's information that's been stored about me. On Amazon, it might store something like my credit card number so that it can ship me books, TV, stuff, on a monthly basis, a brand new Apple charger cable because my cats seem to think that they are tasty, tasty milk-flavored Twizzlers as opposed to something I desperately need on a day-to-day basis. So that's how that information gets stored. So that's what a database is. What questions do you have about what I've just described and the metaphor that I've just used? Any questions, any thoughts about what it is? Is that pretty clear? Give me nodding heads if you like it, or shaking heads if you don't understand what the hell I'm talking about. Good, reasonably no shaking heads at this point. All right, so that's what it is, a big bucket with strings tied to it. On the outside of the bucket is a little label that says, this is what this thing is. Feel free to yank and you'll get that chunk of stuff. So, to expand out on our metaphor a little bit more, the most common kind of database that you're going to run into right now is one that uses SQL, or structured query language. I think I said sequential or structured or something. I don't know. Whoever remembers the things that actually go behind acronyms. I certainly don't. So, structured query language. What are the words structured query language mean to you? Are they just like jargon? What does it sound like? What does it sound like the thing is going to do if you use it?
Specific ways of asking for exactly what you want.
Very specific ways of asking for exactly what you want. That is a great answer to that question. It's a very specific way, a very formal way of asking which one of those strings you want to tug on in the bucket full of stuff. Okay? SQL is certainly a programming language in a way. What it is a language that lets us do something very specific with a certain kind of computer technology. But mostly what you find in applications, on the internet, in any of the places that you're going to be working, is you find variations on SQL. There's a base concept of a structured query language, and then there is the version of that that's a way easier to use. Most of you are going to bump into MySQL, first of all. Given that this is Seattle, the other thing you'll bump into is SQL Server, MS SQL instead of MySQL, Microsoft SQL or MySQL. What does MySQL even stand for? Hell if I know. Find out. So somebody Google what MySQL stands for. I think it just means, is it Mycroft or something? I forgot. So MySQL is the open source, very commonly used one that you'll find in a lot of different web applications. You will, as you start to get more targeted about what kind of databases you want to use, there are certain kinds of databases that are built better for storing things like documents instead of pictures, or storing things like relationship information than others. This information is a little bit older, but from what I recall, about 18 months ago, I heard that Facebook had 4,000 shards of MySQL databases running over 9,000 individual nodes. So Facebook has to store all those relationship information pieces that you have. Like when you say, it's complicated, someplace somebody has to put that into a field so that you can pull that back up, or someone who's looking at your profile can pull it back up. So the reason that we have these different kinds of variations on how you store information is to make it easier for the people who are creating the applications. Now that I've said that about these different kinds of databases, how do you, and when I'm kind of giving you a hint by starting to talk about relationships, but can you tell me a very common kind of database? MySQL is a very good example of this. Anyone know what I'm asking for? It's called a relational database. And the reason that it's called a relational database is because you find information in relationship to one another. When you have a spreadsheet, which is an example of a database, although one that people tend to migrate away from as fast as possible, what you have is a series of columns and a series of rows, right? And in your columns, you probably have data, and in your rows, you have entries, okay? If I was going to do something like make a Christmas card mailing list, I might have, say, 50 entries in a spreadsheet that starts at the top with name, address. Do I send them the good Christmas card, or do I send them the Costco Christmas card? Do I have enough supplies to do this? And did I have my husband sign them all, right? So that the information there would be, the columns are the kind of information, and the rows are the amount or different entries of information. And that's a pretty good way to think about what a database does too. In relationship with one another, what you might do is try to find out whether or not I sent a Christmas card, because I have a completion marker there probably in my Christmas card list, whether or not I have already sent a Christmas card to my mom or not. And the way that I would do that is I would need to know two things, right? First, I would need to know is there a field that will store whether or not a given Christmas card has been done or not, right? And then who's the person I'm trying to find out about? So you're trying to find the intersection of those pieces of information in relation to one another, okay? And the abstraction away from that concept of the spreadsheet is the relational database, where you have something called a table. And a table is going to store data like that. It'll store things like, for instance, in a WordPress installation, the list of all the users who have the right to sign into that website. You can go into the user table inside a WordPress database that has multiple tables in it and find all the users and list it out against each other. Those tables you can cross-index or cross-query with other tables like how many times has this user made a comment in the last month, to pull out really interesting information about how people behave on the internet or in your WordPress site. Does that make sense? What you're doing is you're looking at information in relationship to one another. When I say table, I just mean a chunk of information that's a lot like each other. Probably the users, or the number of posts that you have. Each individual post that you have stored in a table. One thing that you might want to do is you might want to say something like, how many posts have I ever made on WordPress? When you look at number of posts and it says 143, what's happening behind the scenes is that your WordPress installation, written in PHP, which you're all learning here, has executed a query on the database, on the WordPress database, and said, how many entries are in the posts table? All right, I'm not going to go through select from table here, etc. There's no reason to do that. The answer that you gave, which is that it's very formalized, totally suffices. Assume that there's a formal way of doing that, but that the real question is just how many times has the post, how many rows are in the post table, basically. And it'll say 143. And so the number that shows up, all nice and formatted in CSS in the font that you want to use on the front of your web page, WordPress site, is there are 143 posts. Now, what do you think might be happening when you look, and you all have seen WordPress sites, I'm assuming. I know most of you are going to at least be building WordPress sites, especially in this program. How many of you have seen a WordPress site or a blog site that has archives on the side over here? Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes, good. So on the archives, it might say something like March 2012, 7 entries. What do you think is happening there? What do you think is the question that's being asked behind the scenes by the installation, the WordPress installation, to the WordPress database? How would you phrase that question?
How many entries were made on the specified chunk of time?
How many entries in what table? The posts table.
Yeah.
Yes. And then what do you think you'd say in that question? How many entries?
How many entries were made on this month?
In this month, or between these two dates,
yeah.
Right? And it would be in this month, but probably between these two dates, right? And then it'll say, it looks like there are 7 entries that have a prefix of 03, and then in the year 2012, right? And it'll find it in some fashion like that. It'll say, okay, there are 7 entries in the rows between the start of this month and the end of this month, okay? That's exactly what happens. And then when you click on those archives, what do you think the WordPress site does when it's looking for those posts? What's the question that the installation is going to go ask of the database when you click on the March 2012 archive link right there?
What was the data like at this point in time?
What was the data like at this point in time? Okay, what do you mean by that?
Just what was updated to you, what was there and what wasn't there.
What was there and what wasn't there, but also maybe to pull up the posts themselves, right? Because those are stored in the database. Everything is stored in the database. If it's not, you've got trouble. Does that make sense?
Would that include posts before they were edited at that point in time?
That is a good question. Does it include posts before they are edited? It depends on how you have set up your database, but that's a really good question, and it relates to something called version control. We're going to talk a little bit more about version control, but one of the reasons I've had you all set up GitHub accounts is because version control, it still stuns me that is not a required part of any curriculum that I've heard of in any computer program institute other than something along the lines of Berkeley or Stanford. Every single one of you should be practicing and understand and utilize version control through all of the development and the education that you're about to get. I know people that GitHub their address books, their blog posts. I know people that do version control in basically every portion of their life so that they can roll it back at any given point in time. I used to do .bak files, backup files, constantly on any given day before starting work, and it's horrible to do that constantly. So the question that you asked, which is, does it store that data before a certain point, is it can if you wanted to, but it's very likely that what it's storing in the database is the finished version of whatever you've got right there. And then it'll pull it up and put it on the web page. So if you click on an individual post and say, I want the post from March 7th, 2012, what is the database? What are you asking the database to do? Yes, look up the information, but what do you think is the question that's going to be asked of the database? Well, not necessarily the search query. It is a search query, yes, but just tell me in plain language, what do you think the database is going to be asked to get that information? A date, good. Very good, a date. And then given a specific date, what do you think you ask the database? Is there a post there on this day? And if so, can I look at it? Does that make sense? And then PHP displays the post right there in your WordPress installation. So it's one of the things that I try to do with stuff like this, where I have to use giant acronyms and a whole lot of complexity, is point out that all we're ever really doing is restating English. SQL, C++, math, French. I've said this a couple of times now, but the reason I ask you to tell me in plain language what you want it to do is often that's the very first step to solving any one of these computational problems, is say, what do I want the computer to do? Well, I want it to load any posts that happened in April of last year. And I want to specifically load any posts that happened in April of last year that have a word in them like Java. And that might be a specific way to bring up some information that you've stored on your own website over a period of time. The reason you do that is because after that it's a very short step to translating it into select from posts and getting the formal version of that question right. But the first thing you do when you say verbally, what is 2 plus 2? What's the image popping into your head right now when I say 2 plus 2?
Number 2.
The number 2 and the plus sign and the number 2, right? Good, exactly. Do the English words TWO, PLUS, TWO, EQUALS, FOUR come into your head, or do you see the math?
Yeah.
You see the both. Oh, that's actually good. You see both. Most of you nodded your head. You see the math in your head. That's say that you see the math, you hear the English. That is a wonderful way to put what you're doing when you're trying to solve a problem like this, when you try to find information, is state out loud in just plain English what you think the answer or what you think the question should be, and then translate it into whatever language the computer understands. There's some really interesting information going on in what we call natural language processing that can do stuff like that, that can take me talking into a microphone and saying, what's 2 plus 2? And having a window pop up on the computer that says, looks like you asked me, what's 2 plus 2? The answer, I think, is 4. So that's really exciting. That's certainly where some branches of computation are going. But for right now, just translate it in your head. It's very simple to do. And just because I say it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. This is a hard task I'm actually asking. There's such a thing as having a task that is both simple and difficult. There's such a thing as having a complex task that's easy because you know exactly what you have to do. There's just a lot of it and a lot of intermoving parts. But sometimes very simple things can be very difficult to accomplish. And what is 2 plus 2? Making a computer understand that that's what you asked it in your voice is a lot tougher than using a SQL or using a programming language to get that same answer out of it. Computers are very dumb. Don't make them interpret things for you. There's a lot of stuff out there called a program language interpreter. They are indeed interpreting, but mostly what they're doing is they're just translating the stuff you say into and even deeper language, assembly language, that the computer is actually working in. Programming languages themselves are a translation that the computer is going to use to translate to something else. Make sense? Okay, that's what the binary is that we talked about before. So does this help a little bit in explaining what a database is, why it works the way that it does? Big old bucket. You ask it very formal questions, and then it yanks on the right string. Make sense? Excellent. Glad to hear it. Alrighty.